Today we finish off our series that we're looking over the last few weeks, like Edwina just said, called Critical Care, and which is all about how do we as a church go about better caring for people in our world, because ultimately church is supposed to be a hospital, amongst other things. Church is supposed to be like a hospital, and so if we are to be a hospital, then we are to care for one another. We've not just superficially with band-aids and headache tablets or the equivalent thereof, but actually being able to deeply care for people who need help. And lots of people need lots of different help in many different ways. And we as a church are to be involved in the care. There's many things that we cannot do, but that does not mean that we shouldn't do significant things as a church ourselves as well. So this critical care series is about how do we go about better caring for people in our world by looking at some specific things over the course of the last few weeks about what we can do to better care for people. You know, we've looked about how we, what do you do? How do you help someone who may be feeling far from God? We had to look at how do you better support mums? We're looking about how do you help support with people who are dealing with mental illness and helping people's general mental health. We had a look at grief last week. Diane talked to us about grief, and today we're going to be finishing off with another significant thing, which many of us may know about, and some of us know very well about. And so we're going to be talking about something significant in a few moments' time. It talks about in the book of Proverbs 25 verse 28, it says that like a city with broken down walls or walls that are broken through, so is a person without self-control. In the book of Romans in chapter 7, it says in familiar words to many of us, it says this, I'm getting the right one here. It says maybe these are words that you can understand, you can relate to. I know I can. It says, For what am I to do? What I want to do, I do not do. But what I don't want to do, I do. So I'm going to get that. What I don't want to do, I do. And what I don't want to do, I do. It's one of those really interesting things, isn't it? That we find ourselves caught continually in a battle between what we want to do and what we want to do. And a lot of time that comes down to issues of what's going on inside us, things that sometimes we feel like we have no control over. And so what we want to talk about today is saying, how do you better care for people who are dealing with issues of addiction? And so today what we want to do is invite somebody up who may know a thing or two about this. And so at this point I want to invite up Adam Wright. So can we make Adam welcome? So Adam is relatively new to our church, and so we thank you so much, Adam, for being prepared for us to have a conversation today. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Why am I interviewing you today amongst anybody else?
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, so my name's Adam Wright, and I'm up here because in my work I'm a clinical psychologist, and so I have two jobs in psychology. I primarily work in private practice in Epping. And as part of my work, I've had a fair few clients over the years I've worked there with addictions, or whether they be substance abuse or other types of addiction. And I also work as a supervisor to clinical students at Macquarie University as well. So I've been working in private practice now for 9 years.
Wow.
At the same place, and it's really great. It's a Christian practice, actually. We can't advertise ourselves necessarily as a Christian practice. That would be going against psychology ethics, as it were. But a lot of people know we're a Christian practice, and a lot of people come and see us for that reason. Yeah.
Wow. And not only you have professional point of view and experience, which would be invaluable to these types of conversations, but you also have a church history that might be relevant to these conversations as well.
Yes. So growing up, my family, we were part of the Salvation Army. So my first church through most of my life has been the Salvation Army, and my maternal grandparents were Salvation Army officers, and so as part of their work, they dealt a lot with people who had addictions. And actually I didn't tell you this, so my grandfather passed away a couple of years ago, was a Salvation Army officer for 70 years, basically, never stopped. And there was a person who called up a radio station in Melbourne just only a couple of months ago to talk about how much of a difference he made in his life. He was a
Wow.
person who suffered from addiction all his life.
Wow.
And my grandfather just cared for him as much as he could for many, many years.
Yeah,
And even now he's calling up radio stations saying, Joe Wilcox was a person who had a really strong impact on him.
Wow,
Yeah.
well, that's amazing. So you would have seen, as part of the Salvation Army Church, you would have seen a lot of attempts about the church to actually help people with addiction of various nature and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
which
definitely.
Is a great perspective, combining the practical church element along with your professional psychology stuff as well. So that's fantastic. So as you can see, Adam's an authority, if you like, to be speaking about this to us today. So Adam, I just wanted to ask, to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about what the difference is between an addiction, if you like, and what maybe addictive behaviour is? Because maybe that's something that we've never thought about before. A difference between addiction and addictive behaviour. Is there a difference?
Yes. So in psychology, we have this. I mean, what it really comes down to is what we classify as a mental illness is when you have some kind of behaviour or something where it's causing significant impairment in someone's life, and also perhaps a significant amount of distress. And so we would call an addiction probably a mental illness, and that's when some kind of something, whether it might be kind of alcohol use or another drug use or something else, maybe like gambling or computer gaming or pornography, is being done to a point where it's causing a person significant problems in their life. That said, I think all of us have, we all have a tendency towards being able to be addicted to something, because ultimately what addictive behavior, you might say in a more broader sense, is just how our brain is wired in a way to seek out rewards. There's actually a chemical in the brain called dopamine. You might have heard people talk about that a lot. And ultimately, it's a chemical that's associated with the feeling of reward. And we can get that from maybe engaging in some task and completing it. We'd feel pretty good after that, and that's the dopamine happening in our brain. But addictive behavior is when behaviors actually kind of short-circuit that. And there's actually been studies in rats many years ago where they hooked up the rat's brain to stimulate that dopamine when they pressed a button. And they found that once that was set up, the rat just kept pressing the button over and over again. And what it kind of shows is that we all have that tendency to want to seek that out. And addictive behavior is when that kind of gets too much. So that can happen with any kind of behavior, really. But it's just when something might get to that point where it's really causing significant distress, someone can't hold a job down, or that it's affecting their relationships. That's probably when we might call what would be an addictive behavior to be an addiction. Yeah, sure.
And what we know is, in having these conversations here this morning, both for those of us in the room and also anyone who's watching online today, we know that if anybody who's currently suffering from an addiction, if you like, or someone who's been caring for, there's been a family or a family dynamic where there's been addiction, we recognise the difficulty that actually presents. It's an incredibly difficult and it's almost it'll be a trauma in many regards. So we don't have these conversations lightly, because we know that there is significant things that are associated with that. One of the interesting things, and I'm asking for a friend here. Can you actually be like have an addiction to things like chocolate or Coke or something like that? Is that? You mentioned before about there are some we have tendencies to wanting to be, for reward stuff, and so can you be addicted to chocolate? My friend wanted me to ask sort of stuff. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, in a way, kind of.
Yeah.
Maybe I wouldn't go with the word addiction too hard in that sense. Yeah. I mean, something like that it is still activating the dopamine response, but I mean, it would all come down to it would have to come down to the person kind of feeling like that they're losing a sense of control over their behaviour, I think. But if you kind of if there's chocolate there and you can be like, oh, I'll have some, but then, might stop after, even if you probably feel like you had too much, but then you maybe can stop yourself and not thinking about it all the time. And I think the difference is, I think someone might be really feeling like it's an addictive behaviour if there's things like that they can't stop thinking about the behaviour. if they spend all their time trying to get it. So there's probably a difference between, kind of feeling like I'll always have a Tim Tam if it's in the cupboard, versus kind of like someone who, might spend 16 hours playing computer games.
Yeah, okay.
It's a matter of degree, I'd say.
Absolutely. So when it comes to, from your professional experience as well as from your previous church experience, when it comes to addiction, what sort of things typically do we associate with addiction and or addictive behaviour? What are some of the things that we usually associate with that?
Well, if I was to take an example of, if we take alcohol addiction, right, you might see someone with that. Well, of course, they'd be drinking probably every day. They would be drinking large amounts. They would have built up a tolerance. So whereas maybe they might have started only drinking a small amount a day, they're probably drinking quite a lot. Going through, multiple bottles of wine or things like that. They might find that they've tried to stop or cut down on their use of something, and they've found it difficult to do that. They couldn't sustain it. You might find someone with an addiction would, depending on what it is, spend all their day trying to obtain it. That can vary, obviously. With some substances, it's quite difficult to obtain it. Others, like alcohol, it's extremely easy to obtain it. You just have to show up at the bottle shop. And then also there's start to be that element of it's causing significant life disruptions. So it's going to affect them being able to work properly, or they can't maintain their relationships, they can't meet obligations, that kind of thing.
Yeah, okay. So by what you just said there, it's not just alcohol, obviously, the example that you said, but there'll be a number of other things. Gambling would be another one of those things. Even pornography, having addiction to pornography, that'll affect relationships and all that sort of stuff as well. So there are some the typical stereotypical addictions that we might assign to this conversation. Obviously drugs, both illicit and prescription. There's alcohol, gambling, pornography. There might be some others in there as well. Do you feel like there's some other socially acceptable expressions or addictions that we might think is okay but are equally as damaging and harmful, that we should be aware of, not just simply thinking about those big ones like the drugs or alcohol, gambling sort of stuff? There are some other ones there that we need to be recognising also as addictions that are perhaps more socially acceptable.
I think one actually that will probably become more aware of in time will be an addiction to social media.
Okay, yep. That's
actually something I think we aren't really aware of quite to the extent we maybe should.
Yeah.
That would be one. I think we're becoming more aware of how computer games can be addictive.
Yeah.
There would be two, I think, that are probably on the cusp of changing. There was a time when we would have only considered an addiction to be something that was a substance, but now we're opening up the idea that could be more as well. There's one actually as well that you didn't mention, which is sex addiction.
Okay, yeah.
Which, that can be through pornography, but it can also be through other ways as well.
Yeah.
And that can be extremely problematic for people, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So just for clarity, like for some of us, we might be, as we're starting to think about this topic today and hearing the things that you're sharing already, just for clarity's sake, if we find like we're gym junkies, or we find ourselves that we, depending on what we eat, either too much or too little or things like that, would you put that in the addiction category, or is it something else that we have to recognise for what it is as well? Something different in there?
I think certain things, they are a bit more complicated. Mm-hmm. I think for examples of eating and exercise, that I think that could open up other potential disorders that wouldn't necessarily be, well, you might call them an addiction, but you might find that a psychologist would want to kind of refer to it as something else.
Okay.
Because there's a different nature to it.
Yeah.
I think the concept of addiction I'm referring to more is the idea that you've lost control of being of a behavior, and you spend all your time trying to engaging with a behavior.
Yeah.
Something like, if someone was a gym junkie, they'd have to kind of say, I'm doing this too much, and the fact that I'm doing this too much is causing me problems in my life. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where that could potentially come up is, if someone was kind of restricting their eating or engaging in excessive exercise, you know, that could be the potential for some kind of an eating disorder. But that's its own thing, and that's very different from an addiction. It requires a very different approach as to how you deal with someone with that. Because it has different health implications. It has different implications of how the brain is working. And whereas an addiction's different in a sense. But one thing I would say is that, I mean, the key thing with an addiction is that usually it is a behavior in you know, it's a coping mechanism. It's a way of achieving, it's got a function essentially. You won't ever find people have an addiction that don't also have some other kind of illness as well, you know? People who may be abusing alcohol or drugs have probably also got depression and anxiety. Even people with other behavioral ones too. And you won't ever find someone having a trouble with a behavior where it wasn't actually serving some kind of a purpose in their life. And so it's important to remember that it's very easy to fixate on the behavior because that's the thing that you see, but there's usually something behind that. Every time I've had a client who's had some issue with a substance or a behavior, it's always been in service of some kind of other issue in their life. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's something for us really important to recognise, because I think what you just said then was, you know, we can be fixated on the behaviour sort of stuff, on the, let's say, the alcohol, for instance, fixated on the alcohol, and we ignore some of the deeper reasons why the person may be going to alcohol in the first place. So in our care, what I'm hearing you say is, like, in our care, it's not just simply about the alcohol. It's a more of a holistic approach that we need to be caring and digging down a little bit deeper in understanding that person, to actually help them properly, not simply deal with the issue of alcohol, which is quite interesting. I'm not quite sure if that's something we've ever thought about before. We are often, you know, when we might come across somebody who has addictive behaviour or suffering from addiction, and we just see that and say, well, I just need to help deal with that. But if we are to be a caring institute, if we are to be a hospital, we recognise it's more of a holistic approach. There's other things that we need to do with that.
As a church, as an individual seeing someone, you're going to see the behaviour first and foremost. That's going to be the most obvious thing. And yeah, that's right. It's hard. It can be hard to often try and work with someone to see behind that. And sometimes even they might struggle to see it themselves. You know, it's not like people would be able to necessarily openly, honestly say, I'm using alcohol to cover up on something in their life. They may not even be there yet, but it's probably is there.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay. So for those of us, and I know we didn't talk about this previously and things like that, you at the beginning, you said something really interesting, Adam. You talked about the issue about how much control something has over us and things like that. If would be true to say that we would need to do some reflection, be it personal or for ourselves or someone that we may know, if we know that something has greater control over us than we have over it. Is that something that should be something that we should recognise and be concerned about in something? If something has more of a control over us than we have over it?
Well, that actually is interesting. I mean, that's if you know about Alcoholics Anonymous, which was a support group that was founded by Christians themselves, who realised the starting point for them for that whole thing was to realise that they realised that they could not control it themselves.
Yeah.
By themselves, they did not have the capacity to deal with what was happening to them. And so that was the idea, is that, yeah, really, I mean, that's the first step. That's the first step of AA, and that's the first step of any kind of healing when it comes to an addiction, is to realise that this has no power over me. And that is a huge step to make, because we don't want to be so vulnerable with ourselves to kind of say that something that we do has, you know, we have a loss of control. But that's the step at which the start can happen, really, to be able to say, now that I realise that this has control over me and I can't face it myself, whether it's through therapy or whether it's through a support group or both or whatever it might be, you know, you can't really get anywhere unless that starts.
Yeah, sure. That's great. Some of us here have been involved in a thing called Lent. I'm not quite sure if many of us know about Lent, and the encouragement would be, you know, sort of to give up something for around about 40 days in the lead up to Easter and things like that. And I know that when we've been a part of it before, one of the things that we've encouraged us personally is saying we need to think about giving up things that maybe have a little bit more control over us than we have it. So I'm usually, I know my friend usually it does about chocolate, or a couple of years ago. What was that? Sorry. I happened to beat the Coke Zero addiction that I had previously, but my friend used to give up some chocolate for things because I had a huge control over it. Is there anything like, so when it comes to coffee and things like that, when we come to Lent and we recognise the spiritual nature of it, if there's things that we would struggle to consider giving up for Lent because we can't live without that. We've got to have our coffee, we've got to have our chocolate, we've got to have our Coke, and things like that. Because I don't function, well without that. Is that? Do you think that could be? I'm not saying it is, but do you think that could be indicative of something that we need to have a reflect on, and when it comes to potential addictive behaviour, or something that has more control over us than we have over it? If we've got to have our coffee, we've got to have our chocolate, we've got to have our glass of wine with dinner or something like that. If that's some people, I'm not suggesting that's promoting that, but some people may have that. Is that something that we would, or somebody, if we know, is that a telltale sign that maybe there's some reflection that needs to happen there when we would struggle giving up some things, even just for the purpose of Lent?
I think if you have something that you are struggling to give up, I mean, that's interesting and that's important to note for yourself.
Yeah.
I guess in a way, you're kind of talking a bit about something in psychology we call the stages of change. There is this concept that whenever we wish to change a behavior, we go through a process. As you will probably know from your own experience, changing your own behavior is really hard to do. And there's these stages we realize that people go through. And the first stage is called pre-contemplation. And that's the stage where you don't see something as a problem. Yeah? And I think a lot of people would probably get to Lent and realize they're not going to give up their coffee. And they might have some justification for themselves about that and say, you know what, I need it, And they might be in that stage. And they may not change out of that stage, and that's okay. I mean, at the end of the day, if it's not the thing you give up, you've got something else to give up. I mean, that's okay, right? I think, though, the difference is you're talking about the concept of someone realizing this has something on me, this is a problem. And we call that the contemplation stage. Okay. And that's where you may not necessarily be ready to start changing, but you realize something's a problem for you. If you're dealing with someone who has an addiction, you'll often talk to them about it, and you might see it as a problem, and you might hear them say those self-justifying statements. With people, they might say, "Oh, it's not a big deal. I can change when I want to," and that's important to notice. But then you might listen for people who are starting to say, "Actually, no, this is a problem. This worries me," and that's that contemplation stage. And I think that is the key, whether it's for yourself or for someone you care about, is to be listening for. If you're hearing them really not on the page, you trying to tell them to change is not going to work. It's really about waiting for people and hearing people when they're at that stage saying, actually, this is a problem. Okay.
So obviously part of this series is trying to, how do we better care for people in our world, particularly if people are, in this case, suffering from addiction or addictive behaviour. So what do you do? How do you care for somebody who's not at that contemplation stage or the pre-contemplation stage, where they're not even recognising it's a problem? How do we best care for people in those situations?
As a psychologist, if you come across someone who's in that stage, what we always do is just tell people, we just give them education. If someone was kind of saying, like that they're a pack-a-day smoker, but they're okay with that, we might just kind of say some of the facts we know about it and leave that with them. I think that's obviously different for us because that's our role. For someone in the church, I think it's about if you kind of come in, it's very easy to probably see someone doing something bad and to get really frustrated with them and potentially to be judgmental of them. But if you are like that for someone in that stage, they are just going to disengage with you. They're just going to pull back. I think it's about kind of saying, I think it would be probably about kind of being open and saying, I'm worried about you. This seems like a problem for you. But I think the key thing is about not then, but still being there for them, still supporting for them. Because, it's that sense that, if you kind of disengage from them from that, I think that would just feed that that negative cycle, but being able to be there and be like, wow, this person's concerned about me and they care about me, that might be a piece of information that might go in their mind that might help them think about what's happening.
Okay, okay. So there is still, even if they're not recognising it as a problem that we may see it is in their lives, does it bring destruction? It's causing some problems for them personally as well as those around them and things like that. Even if they don't recognise it, there is still some things that we can do in terms of just gentle encouragement and all that sort of stuff. One of the things we mentioned earlier on in the series is that if you lose relationship, you lose influence. And things like that. I suppose that would be a big one is in terms of trying to think about what we can do to help. If we lose influence, if we lose relationship, we lose influence. So what I'm hearing is say is that as long as we can continue to maintain relationship with them, then we can slowly, gently influence them towards considering something that maybe that's affecting them quite deeply in some regards.
I think to add to that, I think is that one of the reasons why people will be in the pre-contemplation stage is because they probably are going to have a mixed feeling in them, and there's going to always be a lot of guilt and shame. And I think it's careful not to kind of impinge on that, because if shame is a really, really difficult emotion for humans to deal with, and usually it's so difficult that we cover it up. And if someone is feeling a sense of shame about something, it's going to trigger defensiveness. And so if you're dealing with someone who's clearly in that stage and, that's that sense of shame there, that's the risk you run is that, they can be like, that defensiveness will trigger that disengagement.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess we're sort of like dealing with two difficult situations where there may be an addiction there that is very much shame-based in terms of what's going on, but then so you don't want to lump a whole lot of shame on them in terms of your encouragement to them or connecting with them. But at the same time, though, you're dealing with a socially acceptable addiction, social media, porn in many regards, or some other things, and sort of stuff. They're not going to feel shame about that because it's socially acceptable in some regards. So trying to be gentle in your encouragement, I think, on either one of those things would be an incredibly a discerning process in many regards to knowing how to go about doing that. Would that be right? The discernment is really important, knowing what addiction you're potentially caring about and the type of relationship you have with the person.
And if an addiction is socially acceptable, I mean, there's nothing. I mean, obviously there are some addictions which like engaging in them carries like legal penalties. If you get caught with certain drugs, you can face criminal proceedings. Those other ones, socially acceptable ones, I think at the end of the day, though, it doesn't matter if it's socially acceptable. It's still you're still going to be noticing or commenting on it because it's excessive. And so, even if there's no rules against using social media, if you're concerned about someone because they seem to be on their phone all the time and you went out to coffee with them and they barely spoke, this is maybe a bit ridiculous, like a bit too far, but but they seem to be checking their phone all the time. And I think it's okay to kind of say, I'm concerned that, this is what's happening, what's going on here, and just asking that question.
Yeah. Wow, it's interesting. There was a restaurant that we went to a little while ago, and they basically had a no phone policy at the restaurant, where you go in there and say, people, families or couples or whatever it may be, you're not allowed to bring your phone out. One of the conditions of entry into the restaurant is not bring out your phone, so that you actually spend the time talking to each other, not trying to dealing with on social media and all that sort of stuff. So there's even little things like if there's some of these social acceptable ones like social media, addiction to it and things like that, there's some gentle boundaries that could be put around the dinner table, for instance, and things like that, which may help develop up a little bit of opportunities to connect and care for those who may be suffering that. So which leads me into the next point, is saying, let's say we do actually have somebody who we are aware of. They are actually somebody who's gone through the contemplative stage, that they do acknowledge that it's a problem and things like that. What are some really practical things that we can do to help support a person who recognises the addiction that they may be suffering? Maybe not even the full extent, but they recognise that there is a problem there of some description. How do we best care for somebody in that type of situation?
Well, it depends. So if they are in that contemplation stage, if you're the first person they've opened up to and said, this is a problem for me and I need help. I think a good starting point would be to help them engage with a service that will help them out of the process.
Okay.
You know, if it means they need to seek out a psychologist or a drug and alcohol counselor or something like that, then that would be a good starting point. If someone's perhaps a bit further on their journey, and that you'll find often too that it's not like it's not like this, you know, for most people who have an addiction, it's something they've been battling with all their life. And you might see that you might have caught them at a time when they were going particularly well, but then they've had a slide, you know? And their life is like this, up and down. And I think that often people who are struggling with these things are able to tell you things like what they need. You know, sometimes they might be able to say, I need someone to keep me accountable. I need you to email me every day to remind me not to do that, or something like that, you know. And you can work with a person, you can ask them, I'm here for you, I'm willing to support you, how can that be? And I'd ask them, and you get them to tell you things you know will help them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting one. You're saying about an accountability buddy, you know, if you like, a partner, just to say, hey, how are you going with that, you know, or whatever. But bringing the elements of accountability in can be helpful, not you forcing it. I've heard you say we don't force accountability upon the person, but we offer that to help them, encourage them through that. And so where accountability is actually helpful for the person achieve the goal of trying to deal with that particular addiction. Wow. Okay. So when it comes to there's some things that some of us might already start thinking about what we can do. What are some of the unhelpful things that we can do when somebody has got addictive behaviour? What are some really unhelpful things that we as a church can do when someone's suffering from that?
It's interesting. I think the answers were said in a previous week. You know, I think that same idea that the thing that you don't want to do for someone who's dealing with an addiction is to be judgmental, or to blame them, and also for or for them to be ostracized. You know, all of those things are going to trigger the shame that they feel inside them, and that's just going to be the worst thing that could be for them. You know, and it's hard, like, because often the time when you see someone engaging in these behaviors and you see their behavior impacting not only themselves, but often too, you'll probably see their behavior impacting the lives of their family or their close ones, or even you personally. It's really hard to do that. It's so easy to be frustrated with them and to, and for that to kind of influence it. So it's a real challenge to be able to be with someone and help hold them accountable in a way that's still loving, and because it is going to be, it's going to be pushing your own own feelings. As it were.
Sure.
I think as well, I guess another thing that's important to say about what's unhelpful is to go too far on the other side and to be enabling, to let something, because a person who's going through an addiction is in a battle between their own will and personal sense of what they want for themselves and these biological urges and these things inside them which pull them the same way. And you'll hear them, you'll always, the challenges with these people when the people are going through addictions is that, they will do unhelpful, self-destructive things all the time. And an unhelpful thing with that is to kind of let them. I think sometimes it's like I think you sometimes do need a tough love approach, and the best way to do that is to separate out their behavior from the individual. To say, I love you for who you are, but your behavior is not good. Your behavior is unhelpful and it's causing problems. And if a person can feel like they and themselves are loved and they are loved for who they are, but it's their behavior that's the problem, that's a lot easier for them to deal with and to because what they're thinking is, I'm the problem. And that's the message they get a lot of the time. And that's the one where you won't get anywhere, is if they feel like they are the problem. To say you've got an addiction, that's an illness, and it's causing you to do things which are unhelpful for you and me and everyone around you, but, I still love you. That's, to me, the way. That's the way to not. That's the way to be helpful.
Okay, so there's a couple of things there. That you mentioned the word just a little while ago about the word ostracised and things like that. But then also you're pointing to the word boundaries in there as well, not enabling and having recognising the behaviour for what it is. How do you make sure that you balance between good boundaries but not ostracising, you know? Because for me, a lot of times, as soon as I start thinking boundaries, I think, I'm just gonna, boundaries is, I'm pushing you away. What's the difference between ostracising and boundaries in that regard?
I think a boundary is not necessarily about, a boundary is about having a limits with someone, about what you will accept, what behaviour you'll accept of them and what you won't accept, and being openly honest about that, you know? The thing is that it's not about necessarily, and I think that's the key, is really about if you have trouble separating the person from their behaviour, then you're going to feel like you've got to push the person away. Mm-hmm. And that's the ostracism. Okay. If you're able to hold that position of being able to be like, I'm not going to push you away, but I don't want to let you get away with things that are going to be unhelpful for you. And a boundary is more about having limits on how you interact with someone or how you are friends with them. That is about, but that's made clear about their behavior choices. Okay. And the thing is that if someone was, I guess the thing is that, like, an example of a boundary, right, would be if you were trying to help someone dealing with a substance problem, and you were agreeing that you were going to catch up with them every week. I guess you might want to set a boundary that, like, we're not going to have any meaningful conversation if you arrive and you're drunk. Mm-hmm. So that's a boundary, right? So kind of saying, I'm here for you, I'm going to support you, this is the way I can do it, but you've got to come to the party as well. And that would be a real challenge for them, but that's a really helpful thing, because then they're like, wow, this person's here for me, but they're not just going to let me get away with things. That's an example of what I mean. Okay. Whereas to kind of say, I can't deal with you at all because of this, that to me is more of the ostracism side. Okay. Well, that may be helpful for us as we think about that, because a lot of times, I don't have a personal experience like some of us here today may have when it comes to addictions and what it's like in family dynamics or close friendships and things like that. But I would imagine that there would be times when the choice between boundaries and ostracism would be a really hard one to make in light of the difficulty that exists in that particular type of situation. Okay, so just trying to bring this in for a landing, because although we could talk about this for a long time, just trying to bring this in for a landing. What would be you've already alluded to this, and so just in case we haven't covered things, any other final encouragements that you'd have for us as a church in terms of how we care with this, or do you think like care for people in this area, or do you think like we've covered that enough? Is there any other final little things that would be really, really good? Like for instance, when you say the word enabling, what does enabling mean? Just a little bit more. Is it if my friend has problems with chocolate, does that mean I don't at Easter time bring over a big basket of Easter eggs and all that sort of stuff? I know he's got problems with chocolate. Is that me enabling him, my friend, what's an enabling in some regards? I guess it's a very broad topic, a very broad concept. In some ways, an example of this would be that, an example of this would be for me, it's really whenever you're engaging in a way that kind of lets, that kind of, helps the behavior kind of stay, kind of stay there, essentially. An example of a rather kind of simplistic example of enabling would be if someone told you that they, had spent too much money gambling, and then you gave them some to cover expenses. Okay. That would be probably an example of enabling. Because the thing is that what might they end up doing with that money? And then there's no, which it's just really hard, because that's the feeling of you might probably have to kind of do that, and that said, it's not that black and white. It's a case by case basis. It would depend. I mean, if it's like, you know, they've clearly, sometimes maybe that's what's necessary for someone if they're really in that point to kind of change their life, but also, you know, you could easily find yourself doing that over and over again. I think that's what I kind of mean by enabling. And to me, it's more about those, it's different from those, like the chocolate or the Coke kind of things. Because, I mean, yeah, like ultimately, unless someone, if someone told you, please don't ever give me chocolate because I can't control myself, and then you gave them a giant bunny for Easter, sure, that's not helpful. But yeah, I think it's more about, to me, when I'm talking about that concept, it's really more about how a church or individuals in the church might be caring for someone with an addiction, which is the kind where it's a real disorder that they're dealing with.
That's good.
Yeah.
Because I guess in many regards, the two options that are before many of us is either pushing the person away or maintaining a relationship with them and just accepting that. And so for us to be loving and caring, it means also not doing anything against the stuff that could be hurting them. But if we're at hospital deals with some heavy stuff sometimes, some critical stuff where you've got to go there. And so, you know, in some regards, we've got to also contemplate our loving response. Is it actually enabling the person, not actually, where we may think that that's something we can continue to do, because we're not judging them, we're not ostracizing them, so I'm being loving and caring, but in fact we're not helping them because we're equally enabling that behaviour to continue.
I think in a church, a lot of people, you may not as a church always be dealing with an individual who's got an addiction, but you'll probably be caring for someone in your church family who's dealing with someone with an addiction, as it were. So like a big thing to remember is that, like, and I think it's, you know, a person who's trying to love and support someone through an addiction, if it's a family member or their partner or a close friend, how you as a church can all rally around that person and help them. Because as what I'm talking about, you can see it's not easy to try and set the boundaries, to try and have that tough love, that kind of vulnerable approach I'm describing. And so if you know someone in your church family who's helping someone through that, supporting them as a community is great. Whether that's helping them come to this church, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe just being able to say, I'm here for you. If dealing with this is so hard for you, you need to talk about your feelings and how, you know, that's a role that everyone can play in that as well.
That's great. That's great. Just bringing this for a landing now, it says in Titus chapter 2, verse 11, it says, for the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people, talking about Jesus here. So let me say that again. For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. Then he goes on and says, it teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright and godly lives in this present age, while we wait for the blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Saviour, Jesus Christ. Where does Jesus fit into all of this? When we're talking about caring for people with addiction, people who are suffering from that of whatever form that may take, where does Jesus fit into bringing hope and strength and transformation? What's your perspective on that?
A lot of people who've gone through addictions, you know, will often, I mean, the Salvation Army has a long history of working with people with addictions, and they will tell you of all the people that they've worked with who've had a life transformation that's come through Jesus. I know a man who was a friend of my grandfather's tell me about a time where a person walked into their service at night, the call to the altar was made, he left his bottle of alcohol at the altar and he walked off and he never drank again.
Wow.
And I think that what that speaks to is that, you know, like, people need to have a reason for their life. And often people who are dealing with addiction have struggled to find that. And so many of them will talk about how, you know, to be like Jesus, you know, that concept is motivating for them to fight. I don't think that person who walked away from the altar would have not craved alcohol ever again. I doubt that. I think he probably would have dealt that the rest of his life. But what he had now was, I've got a reason for me to put this aside. This doesn't serve me anymore. I serve the Lord. And so that's, I think, the difference is that it's that sense of having a value of something that you want to be and a reason to shift. And so suddenly you're not needing to just seek a feeling or try and cope with something, but you're working towards something bigger in yourself.
Yeah,
and that's, to me, how it plays out.
Okay. I suppose, for all of us, we recognise that there's nothing impossible for God. And we recognise that through Jesus' ministry, what he displayed was that he did most incredible transformations that actually occurred. And so for us, we continue to put our hope in Jesus, even in the midst of the darkness and things like that. It's interesting that the Apostle Paul, when he talks about that stuff, he's saying, I do the stuff that I don't want to do, and the stuff I don't want to do, I do. He gets at the end of chapter 7 of Romans, he says, well, what am I to do? And he finishes off this expressing how he deals with stuff like this. He says, what a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. And, I would imagine that for all of us, one of the things that we can always do in our care of people, what we are to do as a church, is to bring Jesus into conversations in our care, because we recognise that our hope is in Jesus, that Jesus can transform, that Jesus can help, that Jesus can sustain and strengthen us through all of this. And so all of our care, whether it be in the addiction or when it comes to grief or any other things that we've talked about before, we can continue to care with Jesus. Jesus is the focus. Jesus is the one who helps us above everything else. And so clearly, what you've been saying today, Adam, there's opportunities for Jesus to come into those particular situations, considering who he is and the power that he exhibits amongst us in our mortal bodies, in our sufferings and things like that. So I've learned a lot from today from Adam. I don't know if you have. Can we give Adam a round of applause? Thank you so much, Adam. That's great for the opportunity just to hear something of your wisdom and experience from that really, really great job. Thank you, mate. Look, as I said earlier on, sort of stuff, what we've talked about today may have triggered something for you personally in light of your family experiences or your experiences with friends or whatever it may be. And if you need to pray about that, seek prayer, need to seek Jesus about any of that stuff we've spoken about today, please, in a few moments' time, while the band is going to sing our final song today, I'm just going to be outside. And if you want prayer for any things related to this type of topic in particular today, please don't leave here without the opportunity to seek prayer for this. If there's anything else going on in your world as well at the moment, then please, I would love to pray with you about that as well. But we just know that this issue of addiction, but for us personally, as well as for those people in our world, may be a really sensitive, difficult one that's been a journey of incredible trauma. And we don't want to underestimate the significance of that journey. So if you need prayer today, and particularly if you're online today and you need prayer for any of that, please just reach out and we'd love to pray with you or meet up and have a talk with you about how today may have, what may have stirred up for you as well. So I hope that you've learned something through this series, through this critical care series, because ultimately, like I said, for us as a church, we don't want to merely be about superficial band-aids and headache tablets, although that may be important and needed in some regards, but we need to be prepared to have conversations and deal with deep stuff, and we're prepared to care for one another with deep issues. So that's how we are really God's church. We are really the church of Jesus when we do deal with deep stuff, because Jesus dealt with deep stuff. And if we are Jesus' church, then we also deal with deep things. So I'm just going to close in prayer now for this series, and then we'll finish off with a song. Gracious Father, I give you thanks and praise that through the course of this series that you have helped us. Lord, for many of us, we may not be dealing with any of these situations that we've covered in this series at the moment. But there could be a time when there's someone at work, someone in our extended family, someone even within the church that may be going through and experiencing any of those things we've spoken about in this series. And We want to be people who help. We want to be people who are expressions of your love and care for people. We want to be used by you to bring healing and restoration through the power of your Holy Spirit into people's lives, into people's worlds. And so we just want to be the type of church that cares deeply, engages profoundly, helps significantly a world that is hurting so much. Lord, move us away from mere superficialities to actually delving deep into the care and love for people, we ask. Lord, I pray that you start with me in that. And if there's anybody else who's praying this prayer as well, Lord God, work on our hearts as well, Lord, and give us, continue to encourage us and transform us to be deeper carers and lovers of the world that you love so much as well. So just help us now. And let our eyes always be fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Jesus, in whom we hope for now and for all eternity. Jesus, who transforms. Jesus, who nothing is impossible for. Jesus. Let us focus on him. I'm going to pray this now in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.